The moment they told me to pack my things and get out, I was still holding the little boy's hand. His fingers were wrapped around mine the way a child grips something when he is terrified, small and cold and trembling, and I could feel his pulse fluttering like a trapped bird against my palm. He was 7 years old, burning with fever, sitting on a hard-backed chair in the narrow back hallway of the Magnolia Grand Hotel restaurant where I had worked for 11 years. And he was trying very hard not to cry because somewhere in the last 2 hours, he had decided that he trusted me. He had decided, in the particular way that sick children decide things, that the woman who had brought him lemonade and knelt beside his chair and spoken to him like he was a real person worth speaking to, that she was the one safe thing in a room full of adults who were not paying attention. And now his father, who I did not yet know was one of the wealthiest men in the state of Georgia, was standing 3 feet away with his arms crossed and his jaw set, watching my manager fire me in real time, and none of them, not Marcus, not the other waitstaff frozen at the service station, pretending to refill things that did not need refilling. Not the kitchen staff pretending to wipe counters that were already clean. Not a single soul in that hallway said one word to defend me. I want you to hold that image for a moment before we go anywhere else. A woman who has given 11 years of her life to a place, holding the hand of a child who is sick and frightened, being told to leave. I want you to hold it because everything that comes after this story, every twist, every reversal, every moment of grace and justice that you are going to hear about in the next hour, grows from this image like a tree grows from a seed. You cannot understand the height of it if you do not understand the depth of where it started. My name is Delia Ray Monroe. I am 41 years old. I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Macon, Georgia, with my grandmother, Ray Louise Monroe, who worked double shifts at a textile plant for 38 years, until her hands curled in on themselves like dried autumn leaves, and she could no longer grip a coffee mug without wincing. She never complained about her hands. She never complained about anything, which I used to think was a form of strength, but which I now understand was a form of survival that she had refined over decades, until it was indistinguishable from strength. She told me every single morning before school, standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard where nothing much grew because the soil was too sandy and the shade too deep, that dignity was the one thing nobody could take from you unless you handed it to them first. I did not fully understand what she meant when I was 8 years old. I did not fully understand it when I was 20. I understand it now in a way that lives in my bones. I am telling you about my grandmother first because she is the foundation of this story, even though she has been gone for 6 years and was not in that hallway and never saw the Magnolia Grand. She is the foundation because everything I did on that Thursday afternoon in November, every choice that looks, in retrospect, like either extraordinary courage or extraordinary foolishness, depending on where you are standing when you look at it, was built on the 38 years of doubled shifts and curled hands and morning words at a kitchen sink. Without Ray Louise Monroe, I am not the woman who knelt beside that child. Without her, the story does not happen. If you are watching this right now and you have ever been told that your worth is conditional on your usefulness to other people, that your loyalty only counts when it is also convenient, that you are replaceable because everyone is replaceable, stay with me. Because this story is for you. And before we go anywhere else, I need you to do something for me right now. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Drop your name and your city in the comments below. Tell me where you are watching from, because we are building something here, a real community of people who believe that goodness is never wasted, even when everything around you is telling you that it is. I read every single comment. I want to know you are here. Now, let me take you back to the beginning because you cannot understand the end without it. I started at the Magnolia Grand when I was 30 years old. I started there the same year my mother died of a heart attack in her living room in Macon with the television on and the phone 3 feet away. The same year my marriage ended in the particular quiet way that marriages sometimes end. Not with a fight or a revelation, but with the slow mutual recognition that two people have become strangers who share a mortgage. The same year that I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a Walgreens at 2 in the morning, crying in a way that felt like wringing water out of something that should have been dry already, because everything I had planned and everything I had expected and everything I had worked toward had collapsed at the same moment, the way certain buildings collapse, all at once, leaving nothing but the foundation and the silence. I had a daughter to raise. Her name was Priya, and she was 4 years old, and she had my grandmother's eyes, which were deep brown and steady in a way that made you feel like she could see through things. And she had her father's stubbornness, which was the kind of stubbornness that is not unpleasant but is absolute. And she had my own terror tucked somewhere inside her chest like a small, fierce secret that she was too young to name. I needed work that paid real money with real hours and real benefits, and the Magnolia Grand offered all of those things if you could handle the pressure of fine dining, which I could, because pressure was the only language I had ever spoken fluently. I had been serving tables since I was 15 years old. I had worked my way through 2 years of community college on tips and weekend shifts. I knew the work. I knew what it required. And I needed what it could give me. The Magnolia Grand was not some ordinary restaurant. It sat on the ground floor of a 5-star hotel in downtown Atlanta, the kind of place where the lighting was always warm and flattering, and the tablecloths were always pressed to knife-sharp edges, and the glasses were always polished until they held no fingerprints, and the guests always seemed to arrive already knowing, at some cellular level, that they deserved to be there. The menu changed seasonally, designed each quarter by a chef who had trained in France and Lyon, and briefly, dramatically, under a James Beard Award winner in New York before returning to Atlanta for reasons he never fully explained. The wine list was 30 pages long. The servers were expected to know the provenance of every ingredient on every plate, which I did, because I studied. I studied the way I had once studied for college exams that I had taken while also working weekend shifts and watching Priya on weeknights. I memorized vintages and preparation methods and allergy cross-contamination protocols. I learned which regulars liked their water still, and which ones liked it sparkling, and which ones would never say a word, but would simply return the glass with a tight, controlled smile if you got it wrong. I learned to read a table from across the room the way you learn to read weather from the color of the sky, without having to think about it, without being able to explain exactly what signals you are processing. I learned to carry 4 entrees and 2 desserts without a tray. I learned the art of being present without being intrusive, which is harder than it sounds, and which requires you to make yourself almost invisible while simultaneously making every person at the table feel like they are the most interesting, most important, most deeply attended to people in the world. I was good at this. Not just competent. Good in the way that is rare enough to be noticed and reliable enough to be counted on. The kind of good that earns you the window tables and the parties of 12 and the guests who request you by name when they call to make reservations. The kind of good that earns you Employee of the Month 7 times across 11 years of service, which I know because those 7 plaques were hanging in a little cluster on the wall above my daughter's school photographs in my apartment. And I looked at them every morning when I made my coffee and felt something I will call pride, even though pride was always a complicated feeling for me. The kind of feeling my grandmother's generation was taught to hold quietly and close to the chest where no one could see it and use it against you. 11 years. I want you to understand what 11 years of a job means. It is not just time served. It is thousands of mornings of setting your alarm for 5:30. It is the particular intimacy you develop with a workplace, knowing which burner runs hot and which walk-in door sticks in winter, and which supplier sends the good lemons on Tuesdays. It is knowing your colleagues' children's names and their back problems and their quietly held ambitions. It is the way you learn to move through a space like it is an extension of your own body. 11 years at the Magnolia Grand meant that I had served dinners to governors and musicians, and athletes and executives and celebrities whose names I will not mention because discretion is a habit so deep in me it feels structural. I had managed crises that never became crises because I caught them first. I had calmed guests who were unreasonable and stayed professional with guests who were unkind, and found the right word for the exact right moment more times than I could count. I had been the person who could be counted on, and I had been counted on, and that counted for something to me even when it did not count for anything to the people who held my employment in their hands. Marcus Delaney became my manager 4 years before everything fell apart. He arrived from a corporate hospitality training program in Dallas with a binder full of efficiency metrics, and a brand new blazer, and a smile that I recognized immediately as the smile of a person who uses smiling as a professional tool rather than as an expression of actual feeling. He was 34 years old, which meant he was 7 years younger than me, and he had the confidence that comes to certain kinds of men in management positions, a confidence not built from experience, but from the mere fact of the position itself, from the blazer and the binder, and the office with his name on the door. It is a specific kind of confidence that I have encountered before and since, the kind that requires, for its maintenance, that the people around it appear slightly smaller, slightly less competent, slightly more in need of direction. Marcus was not cruel in any simple or obvious way. He was the particular kind of difficult that is much harder to name and much harder to address. The kind that comes from a person who has been told they are exceptional without being given sufficient evidence, which makes them insecure in ways they cannot acknowledge to themselves, and which they compensate for in ways that are very easy for everyone else to see. He needed things done his way not because his way was demonstrably better, but because the doing of them his way was itself the point. He needed to feel that the room was under his control. He needed, most of all, for the people working under him to be slightly less than him in every visible category that mattered in front of witnesses. I was a problem for Marcus because I was not slightly less than him in any visible category. The guests knew it. The kitchen staff knew it. The other servers knew it. The ownership group knew it, which I know because the hotel's general manager had told me 3 times over 11 years, twice during formal reviews and once over coffee in her office on a difficult afternoon, that I was among the most valuable people they had in the building. Marcus knew all of this, which meant that for 4 years we existed in a delicate and exhausting dance where I did excellent work, and he found reasons to qualify it, where I earned commendations, and he framed them as team achievements, where I solved problems before they became problems, and he noted the original irregularities in his logs so that he could reference them in future conversations as evidence of something. He never said anything to me that was overtly unfair. He was too careful and too calculating for that. But the weight of his disapproval was something I felt every shift, quiet and persistent, like a pebble in your shoe that is too small to stop you, but too present to ignore. I tell you this so you understand that by the afternoon everything fell apart. I was not a woman who made careless or impulsive decisions in professional settings. I was not the kind of person who overstepped without thinking. I was a woman who had spent 11 years in an environment that did not forgive oversights, making careful, deliberate, considered choices about how to do her job. What I did that Thursday afternoon was not carelessness. It was the most considered choice I had ever made in 11 years of careful choices, and it cost me my livelihood, and I would make it again. It was a Thursday in November, 22 days before Thanksgiving. I know the exact day and the exact number of days before Thanksgiving because Thanksgiving was the biggest revenue event of the restaurant's year, and the preparation for it was already underway. And the kitchen was beginning to receive the specialized seasonal orders, which I know because I could smell the particular combination of fresh sage and imported Gruyere that the chef used in the signature stuffing preparation, a smell I had come to associate with the turning of the year. The restaurant was not fully booked for lunch service that afternoon. The midday rush had thinned out, and we were moving into the quiet mid-afternoon hours that the long-term staff called the golden hour, partly because of the warm November light that came through the south-facing windows in long horizontal strips across the tablecloths, and partly because it was the hour when the pace slowed, and the guests who remained had chosen to be there slowly, lingering over dessert and coffee and conversation. I had 3 tables. A couple at table 7 celebrating their 35th anniversary, the wife in a dress that she had clearly chosen specifically for this lunch, the husband slightly uncomfortable in his jacket, but committed to the occasion in a way I found genuinely moving. A businessman at table 12 who had ordered the seared salmon and was conducting what appeared to be 3 simultaneous phone calls and had barely looked at his plate. And a new arrival at table 4 that had been seated while I was delivering the anniversary couple's dessert course, a warm chocolate fondant with sea salt caramel that I had carried very carefully because the presentation was temperature sensitive and the chef was exacting about it. Table 4 was a man and a boy. I registered them across the room in the quick, practiced way I took in new tables, gathering information without staring. The man was maybe 45. His suit registered before his face did, the way the highest quality things sometimes register slightly, before you can consciously identify what you are seeing. The suit was the kind of suit that has been made for exactly one body and no other body, and the body it had been made for was this man's, and it fit him with the kind of precision that makes the wearer look like they exist at a slightly different resolution than everyone else in the room. He had silver at his temples and a jaw that spoke of habitual decision-making. He was handsome in the way that powerful men sometimes are without seeming to be trying for it, not because of the individual features, but because of the complete, total certainty of his posture, the absolute absence of hesitation in how he occupied space. He was on his phone when I came to the table. He did not look up. The boy was a different thing entirely. I registered him the way I register children at tables, with a particular attention that I developed first as a mother and then honed as a server. Because children at fine dining tables are often uncomfortable in ways the adults accompanying them have stopped noticing. And a server who notices that discomfort and addresses it quietly can transform the experience for the entire table. He was small in the way of a boy who has not yet hit the growth that is coming, and he was sitting with his hands folded on the table and his eyes moving around the room with a quality of attention that I recognized. It was the attention of a child who is not comfortable, who is tracking the room for information, who has learned to read adult moods and environments as a form of self-protection. He was wearing a blue sweater over a collared shirt, the kind of careful outfit that a nanny or a particular kind of father puts a child in for a nice lunch. But the sweater had pulled at the collar, and the collar had gone slightly crooked, and there was something about the sum total of him that spoke of a day that had started with careful arrangements and had since become longer than anyone had planned. I went to the table. The man did not look up. I introduced myself pleasantly and said I would give them a moment to look at the menu. He held up one finger, the particular way that certain people hold up one finger to indicate weight, a gesture I had long ago stopped finding rude because I understood it was simply the vocabulary of someone whose attention is always in multiple places simultaneously. I turned to the boy, who had been watching me since I approached, and I crouched very slightly and said, "Hi there." My name is Delia. What's yours? He looked at me. I watched the negotiation on his face, the brief internal question of whether he was supposed to talk to the server, whether this was permitted, whether there was a protocol he was violating. Then he said, carefully, Noah. I said, Noah, that's a great name. I know a few Noahs and they are all excellent people, so you are in good company. And I said, have you been to our restaurant before? He shook his head, still watching me. I said, well then I need to tell you about something we make here that I think you will enjoy. We make fresh lemonade every single day with real lemons from a farm in Florida. And instead of regular sugar, we use a little bit of local honey. And the result is the kind of lemonade that people close their eyes when they take the first sip because it is that good. Would you like to try it? He looked at me for a long moment, and something in his face changed, very slightly, just enough. He said, yes, please. I said, excellent choice. I will be right back. I brought the lemonade. The man was still on the phone. Noah wrapped both small hands around the glass and brought it to his lips and took a sip and closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. I felt the warmth that particular moment always gave me, the small, clean satisfaction of having predicted something correctly about a person and then seen the prediction confirmed. I took the man's order when he concluded his call, which required another 7 minutes of waiting nearby without hovering. A skill that is entirely about controlling your own body language and the direction of your gaze. He ordered efficiently and without making eye contact with me, which I did not take personally, and he ordered for Noah as well without asking Noah what he wanted, which I noted because I always noted these things, but which I said nothing about because it was not my place and Noah had not indicated any distress about it. I went to put in the order. It was 12 minutes later, when I returned to the table to check on them, that I saw what I had not seen before. Or perhaps I had seen it and not registered it fully, the way you sometimes know something before you know it. Noah's face had changed. The small warmth I had introduced with the lemonade and the brief exchange of names had gone. He was very still again, but a different kind of still. Not the careful, watchful still of before, but the particular stillness of a child who is managing something happening inside his body, directing all of his attention inward, trying to hold something together through pure concentration. His face had a grayish quality beneath the olive of his complexion. There were shadows under his eyes that seemed to have appeared from nowhere, the kind of shadows that fever brings when it is rising fast. His lemonade sat untouched, the glass sweating in the warm room, and he was looking at the tablecloth. His father was looking at his phone. I did not make a production of it. I did not stand over the table and announce my concerns. I went to Noah's side of the table and I crouched beside his chair, which I did because it is always better to speak to a child at eye level when possible, and I said quietly, "Hey, Noah, how are you doing over there? Is everything okay?" He looked at me, and there was the negotiation again, more serious this time. He was deciding how much to tell me. He was deciding whether this was a safe place to tell the truth. I watched him make the decision and I waited, which is one of the most important things you can do when you are asking a child something real. Finally, he said, very quietly, "I don't feel very good." I put the back of my hand against his forehead before I consciously decided to do it. It was pure instinct, the same instinct that has existed in every person who has ever cared for a child, as old as human concern itself. He was burning. The heat of it was immediate and unmistakable. This was not the warmth of a restaurant that keeps its temperature slightly elevated for guest comfort. This was a child with a serious fever, and the fever had been building for some time. I stood up slowly and looked at the man and said, "Excuse me, sir." He looked up from his phone. I said, "I think Noah might not be feeling well. He seems to have a significant fever." The man's expression shifted. I have thought about what I saw in his face in that moment many times since. There was concern in it, yes, but underneath the concern was something else. Something that I now understand was the expression of a man who had been here before and had learned a particular way of navigating being here. A way that was not serving him or his son, but that had the grooves of habit worn deep into it. He put his phone down and leaned forward and looked at Noah and said, "Noah, buddy, we talked about this." Noah said, very quietly, "I know, Dad. I'm sorry." The apology hit me somewhere I was not expecting. A 7-year-old boy, burning with fever, apologizing for being sick. Apologizing for the physical reality of his own body's distress. Apologizing to his father for the inconvenience of being unwell, with the ease of someone who has made this apology before and expects to make it again. I had to look away for a moment because my face would have said something my professional judgment would not have permitted. The man looked back at me and his voice was controlled and reasonable and firm. He said he gets anxious sometimes. It manifests physically. We've been working with his therapist on this. He'll be fine. Can you bring the food when it's ready? I looked at Noah. Noah was looking at the tablecloth with his hands still folded and his face still gray. There was a fine line of sweat along his hairline that had not been there 12 minutes ago. I said, "Of course." And I walked to the kitchen. I want to be absolutely honest with you about the 4 minutes I spent in that kitchen, because they are the 4 minutes this entire story turns on. I stood by the service station, and I thought about what I had seen, and I ran through every calculation available to me. I thought about Marcus and his efficiency metrics and his careful log of anything that could be reframed as a performance issue. I thought about my mortgage, which was $842 a month. I thought about Priya's school and the after-school program that cost $200 a month, and that she needed because my hours did not end until 9 on weeknights. I thought about my 11 years and my 7 Employee of the Month plaques and the specific way Marcus had been looking for an opening for 4 years. I thought about all of these things, and I held them against what I had seen on Noah's face and in the shadows under his eyes and in the way he had said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And then I went to the first aid station, which every commercial kitchen in the state of Georgia is required by law to maintain, and I took the certified digital thermometer that lived in its sealed case on the second shelf, and I walked back to table 4. I did not ask the father's permission. I know how this sounds. I know what it looks like from the outside. I have thought about it many times since, and I have asked myself whether I would do it differently, and the answer I keep arriving at every time is no. Asking the father's permission had already produced an answer that I had evaluated against what I was seeing with my own eyes and found to be insufficient. So I crouched beside Noah and I said, "Hey, Noah, can I just check something super quick?" He looked at me, and then he looked at his father, and his father was frowning but had not said no, and so Noah nodded, and I took his temperature. 103.2 degrees Fahrenheit. I stood up. I looked at the man across the table and I said, "Sir, your son has a temperature of 103.2 degrees. That is high enough that I would not be comfortable serving him a meal and proceeding as though that number is not significant. With your permission, I would like to contact the front desk and ask if there is a quiet space available, or if you are a hotel guest, I can have someone from the concierge team assist him upstairs. I am not trying to alarm you, and I am not diagnosing him. I am telling you what the thermometer says because I believe you need to know it." The man looked at me for a long moment. His face had gone through several things and settled on something I could not entirely read. He said, "I didn't ask for your assessment of the situation." I said, "I understand that, sir. I am sorry for overstepping. But that is the temperature reading, and I felt it was important to share it with you." He said, "I think I know my own child." I said, "I'm sure you do." He stood up from the table. He was taller than I had registered from across the room. He said, "I'd like to speak with your manager." I said, "Of course. I'll get him for you right now." Marcus arrived with the particular speed of a manager who has been watching a situation develop from a distance and has been waiting, with the specific patience of someone who has wanted an opening, for exactly this call. He appeared at the table before I had finished the sentence of summoning him, because he had been close enough to watch the whole thing, and I knew it. The man spoke to Marcus in a low, controlled voice for about 90 seconds, and even from 3 feet away, I caught the words unauthorized, inappropriate, and overreach. Marcus's face went through its professional sequence of expressions and settled into the grave concern that was its most practiced performance. Marcus said, "Delia, step into the back hallway, please." I followed him. The door to the hallway closed behind us. Marcus looked at me with the eyes of a man who has been waiting 4 years for a reason that will hold up under scrutiny and has found one. He said, "Did you make physical contact with that guest's child without parental consent?" I said, "I took his temperature. He has a fever of 103 degrees. He said, "That is not what I asked you." I said, "Marcus, the child has a high fever." He said, "Delia, did you use restaurant property without authorization and make physical contact with a minor guest without his parents' explicit consent?" The way he structured the question was careful. He was building a record in real time. I understood what was happening. I had understood from the moment I saw his face at the table that this was what was happening. I said, "I took his temperature because he was sick and his father wasn't seeing it." Marcus said, "That is a judgment call that is not within your authority to make. That is a guest's child. The guest told you the child was fine. You overrode the guest's assessment of his own child's medical condition using restaurant property to conduct what amounts to an unsolicited medical examination of a minor." He paused to let that settle. He said, "I have to let you go, Delia." I looked at him. I said, You are firing me for taking a sick child's temperature. He said, I am terminating your employment for unauthorized physical contact with a minor guest, unauthorized use of restaurant property, and directly contradicting a guest's explicit instruction in a manner that created a guest relations incident. I said, Marcus, I have been here for 11 years. He said, I know, and I am genuinely sorry. But this is not something I have the discretion to manage differently. He was not genuinely sorry. I want to be clear about that for the record and for the people watching this who have been on the receiving end of professional apologies that contain exactly zero genuine feeling. Marcus Delaney was not sorry. He was satisfied in the particular way of a person who has finally gotten the thing they wanted and has the professional acuity to dress it in the language of regret. I stood there for a moment in that hallway. I felt the weight of 11 years lift off me all at once, and the lifting was not like freedom. It was like the moment after a wave knocks you down in the ocean when everything goes quiet and dark and you cannot tell which way is up. I breathed through my nose. I said, all right, Marcus, if that is your decision. I took off my apron. I folded it carefully and set it on the shelf beside the door because 11 years of habitual care does not stop on command. I turned toward the locker room. The door behind me opened. Noah was standing in the doorway. He was still holding onto the frame the way children hold onto things when they are uncertain of whether they are allowed to be somewhere. His face was flushed with the high color of fever, and his eyes were bright in the particular way that very high fevers make eyes bright, slightly too bright, slightly too shining. He looked at me and he said, in his small, careful voice, "Are you leaving because of me?" Everything in my chest cracked open. I crouched down. I said, "No, sweetheart, absolutely not. You did nothing wrong. This is not about anything you did." He said, "My dad said you were causing a scene." I held his gaze. I said, "Noah, listen to me very carefully. You are sick and your body needs rest and water and medicine and care. Will you tell your dad that? Will you tell him that you need to go upstairs and lie down?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached out and took my hand. Both of his small hands wrapped around my fingers and he said, "I don't want you to go." I heard Marcus say my name behind me. I heard the man's voice from somewhere in the restaurant, sharpened with impatience, asking where Noah had gone. I held Noah's hand for one more moment, long enough to feel his pulse and his warmth and the complete trust in his grip. I said, "I have to go, but you are going to be okay. I promise you that." I stood up. I walked to the locker room. I took the photograph of Priya down from the inside of my locker door, the one from her third-grade class picture, where she was wearing the red cardigan and her hair was in 2 braids, and she was smiling with the confidence of a child who has not yet learned to smile for photographs in a way that hides what she actually feels. I put it in my bag. I put my spare shoes in my bag. I took my good pen, the one I had bought for myself as a small celebration after my 5th employee of the month. I took it all. I walked out through the service exit because I did not trust myself to walk through the dining room, past the anniversary couple and their fondant and their 35 years, past the businessman who had barely touched his salmon. I sat in my car in the parking garage on level 2 in the dim yellow light that parking garages have, and I sat there for 17 minutes before I was able to drive home. I counted the 17 minutes on my phone's clock because I could not trust my sense of time. Each minute felt like something I had to push through rather than simply wait for, like walking into wind. At minute 11, I began to cry, which I had not done since the parking lot of the Walgreens 11 years ago, and which I allowed for exactly 3 minutes before I stopped and took 4 slow breaths and found the familiar internal place where I put things that I could not afford to feel on a schedule, the place where the grief waited patiently for a time that was appropriate for grief. I drove home. Priya was at school. The apartment was quiet, and the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at a long November angle, and the 7 plaques on the wall looked very small to me suddenly, which they had never looked before. I sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote down the facts of what had happened in the plain language of someone who intends to protect herself legally, and who knows that memory degrades but written records do not. Date, time, temperature reading, exact words spoken by whom in what order. Everything. Then I called a legal aid hotline because I am my grandmother's granddaughter, and she taught me to understand the systems that governed our lives even when those systems were not working in our favor, especially when they were not working in our favor. The woman on the phone was patient and thorough. She told me that the misconduct classification Marcus had used was legally specific and that I had grounds to challenge it. She told me I should document everything. I had already done that. She told me I should file for unemployment immediately. I did that the same afternoon. The days that came after were hard in the specific way that economic hardship is hard, not dramatically, not with the kind of visible crisis that other people can see and respond to, but quietly, with the accumulating weight of small problems compounding each other in the dark. The unemployment denial came 9 days after I filed, because Marcus had indeed classified the termination as misconduct, and the initial determination accepted that classification. I appealed immediately. The appeals process required forms and waiting periods and phone calls that could only be made during business hours, which presented a specific logistical challenge, because by the time the denial arrived, I had already taken a cashier position at a grocery store 2 miles from the apartment, the only job I had been able to secure in 9 days of applying, and the grocery store did not permit personal phone calls on the floor. So I made the calls from the parking lot on my breaks, standing in the November cold in my grocery store vest, explaining my situation to hold music and supervisors and callbacks that did not always come. The cashier position paid $11.25 an hour. At the Magnolia Grand, with my base wage and my average tips across a typical week, I had been clearing just over $32,000 annually. These numbers do not require elaboration. They speak for themselves with the particular eloquence of mathematics, which does not soften things the way words can. Priya was 14, and she had my grandmother's eyes, which meant she saw things. She began eating the school lunch every day instead of packing from home, which she had not done since she was in 5th grade, and which I understood was her attempt to spare me the visible evidence of how much a 14-year-old girl eats. She stopped leaving her shoes by the front door when she came home because her shoes needed replacement, and she had decided, on her own, at 14, that she was not going to ask for that. She stopped mentioning the class trip to Washington, D.C., that her social studies teacher had announced in October, and that had cost $240. She did all of this without saying a word about it, and I noticed all of it, and we did not discuss any of it, which was its own particular kind of conversation. One conducted in the language of people who love each other and are both protecting the other from the full weight of what they know. I tell you this because I want you to understand what the weeks between the hallway and what came next actually contained, because it is easy in a story like this to compress the painful middle into something that sounds like an interlude between the crisis and the resolution, and that compression is a kind of lie. The middle was not an interlude. The middle was real, and it was hard, and it was lived through one shift and one parking lot phone call and one cold evening at a time. There is no fast forward on that. My car needed a brake repair 3 weeks after I left the Magnolia Grand. The estimate was $412. I had $180 in savings because the rest had been drained by the weeks between employment, the weeks during which I had been applying everywhere and hearing back from almost nowhere and eating oatmeal for dinner because Priya needed to eat properly, and there was a limited amount of money and infinite amounts of necessity. I called my grandmother's oldest friend, a woman named Miss Dolers who had known my family since before I was born, and who lived in a house in Macon with a garden and a sense of humor and more generosity than most people know how to accept. Miss Dolers loaned me the money without making me feel the weight of the asking, which is the highest form of generosity I know. I have since repaid it twice over, and she told me both times that I was being ridiculous. 4 weeks and 2 days after I left the Magnolia Grand, I was working a Saturday morning shift at the grocery store, running Register 5, when a woman placed her canvas shopping bags on the conveyor belt and began to unload a cart that contained organic produce and artisan crackers and 3 kinds of sparkling water, and the kind of specialty items that I recognized from the Magnolia Grand's menu development conversations. She was perhaps 50 years old. She had silver-streaked hair that she wore with complete authority, the way certain women wear their age, as a statement rather than an apology. She was dressed in the kind of clothes that have no visible brand because the quality of them is itself the statement. She unloaded her cart while I scanned, and then she looked up at me and she said, "You are Delia Monroe, aren't you?" I looked up from the scanner. I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "I thought so. I am Cecilia Hartman. My son is Richard Hartman." The name connected slowly, the way a name sometimes has to travel from the part of your brain that stores information to the part that makes meaning from it. Richard Hartman. Hartman Property Group. The name that appeared regularly in the business section of the Journal-Constitution and occasionally in the lifestyle sections during philanthropic seasons, and always with the kind of weight that comes from being genuinely significant rather than from wanting to be seen as significant. I said, "I see." She said, "He is Noah's father." I looked at her properly then. I put down the scanner. She had kind eyes, the kind that have seen enough difficulty in their years to recognize it clearly without being unmade by the recognition. I said, "Is Noah all right?" She said, "He is now, yes." She said this with a care that let me understand the weight of the now. She said, "He was quite ill that evening. After you were dismissed, his father took him upstairs to their suite, and by 7 o'clock his temperature had reached 104.5. The hotel had a physician on call and they contacted her, and it turned out Noah had a significant respiratory infection. He needed a course of antibiotics and he spent 3 days in bed. He was very sick, she said, more sick than any of us had understood. I said nothing. She said his pediatrician told Richard afterward that the timing of the intervention, your intervention, I want to be clear about that, your concern for that child, almost certainly prevented the infection from progressing to something considerably more serious. Children's fevers at that age can escalate quickly when the underlying infection is significant. You may have prevented a hospitalization. I looked at the organic kale on the conveyor belt. I said, "I am very glad he is okay." She said, "Delia, my son is not always good at seeing what is directly in front of him when what is directly in front of him is something he finds difficult to see. He and Noah have had some hard years since the divorce, and Richard's way of managing difficulty has not always served Noah well. He is working on this. I am not making excuses for what happened to you at that restaurant. I want to be clear that I think what happened to you was a serious wrong. I am simply giving you context for who my son is, as distinct from who he is capable of being." I said, "That is honest of you." She said, "My husband says honesty is only a virtue when it costs you something." She smiled slightly. She said, "Richard would like to speak with you if you are open to that." She slid a business card across the conveyor belt. She said, "There is absolutely no obligation." But he asked me to bring this to you personally because he felt that an email or a phone call to an unknown number would seem impersonal, and he wanted to give you the choice in a way that felt personal. I looked at the card. I said, "I will think about it." She said, "That is all anyone can ask." She paid for her groceries. She left. I stood at Register 5 for the remainder of my shift with the business card in the pocket of my vest and something happening in my chest that I could not yet name. It was not hope, exactly. I had learned to be careful about hope. It was something smaller and more cautious, the way a plant puts out a single small shoot before it commits to growing, testing the ground before it goes any further. I called the number on the following Sunday evening because Sunday evening felt like a time of my own choosing, a time with no professional performance requirements, a time when I was simply a person making a phone call on her own terms. Richard Hartman answered on the second ring. His voice was the same voice I remembered from the restaurant, the controlled, precise voice of a man who has spent decades making decisions and communicating them. But there was something different in it, a quality of quietness that I had not heard before. The particular quietness of a person who has looked at themselves in a clear light and found the reflection difficult. He said, "Ms. Monroe, thank you for calling. I was not certain you would." I said I was not certain either. He said, "I want to say something before anything else. I want to say that I owe you an apology that is probably not equal to what happened, but that is where I have to begin. I waited. He said, Noah's doctor told me after his fever broke that your intervention was timely and significant. She used the word significant. She said that children with respiratory infections of that severity can progress to acute illness within hours, and that catching the fever when it was still at its early high point, rather than later in the evening when it might have been at 105 or higher, gave them the ability to treat him proactively rather than reactively. She said she was grateful that someone had noticed. He paused. He said that someone was you. And while you were noticing, I was on my phone. I said, Mr. Hartman. He said, I know what I was doing. I know what I was prioritizing. I know that Noah said he did not feel well at various points that day, and that I had dismissed those statements because I had already decided the day was going to be normal, and I needed it to be normal for reasons that, in retrospect, were professional rather than parental. I had a presentation the next morning and a dinner that evening with people whose opinions of me I cared about in ways that I am reconsidering. And I looked at my 7-year-old son who was telling me he was sick, and I chose to believe what I needed to believe, which was that it was anxiety and it would pass, because the alternative was that I was the father who had spent the entire afternoon on the phone while his son burned with fever, and I did not want to be that father. He said this plainly, without hedging, without softening it with qualifications about stress levels or business pressures, in a way that cost him something to say. I listened to it carefully and I filed it carefully. It was not absolution and it was not sufficient, and it was also, genuinely, more than I had expected. I said, "What happened to Marcus Delaney?" He said, "That is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about." He said, after I spoke with my mother, who had spoken with me very directly about what she had observed and what she believed about my conduct, I contacted the ownership group of the Magnolia Grand. Not Marcus. The ownership group directly. He paused. He said, "I am a significant account for that hotel. I have held 3 company retreats there over the past 4 years, and I have directed perhaps 30 corporate bookings to them in that time." He said this not as a threat, but as a fact, a piece of context. He said, "The ownership group reviewed the incident and your employment record and the specific grounds for your termination. They have reversed the misconduct classification. Your record has been corrected." I said, "That does not give me back 4 weeks of income." He said, "No, it does not. And I am aware of that." I said, "What is it you are actually calling to ask me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am calling to ask you something specific, and I want to be precise about it because I think precision is important, and I think you are a person who will respond better to precision than to flattery." He said, "I recently acquired a boutique hotel property in Midtown Atlanta. 12 rooms, a small restaurant, and event courtyard. The property has been underperforming for 3 years under its previous management, not because of the physical space, which is excellent, but because of the culture, the way guests experience the people who serve them. I have been through 2 candidates from a major hospitality consulting firm to lead the guest experience side of the operation, and neither of them has been right." I said, "What does right mean?" He said, "Right means someone who knows instinctively what it means for a guest to feel genuinely seen rather than efficiently processed." Someone who has spent enough years in real hospitality. Not hospitality theory, real hospitality. The kind where you carry 4 plates and read a room from across it, and remember that the couple at table 7 had their anniversary last March. To have developed a sense of this that cannot be taught from a binder. He said, "What I am looking for is someone who sees a child with a fever and does something about it even when doing something about it is personally costly. Someone who, when it matters, puts the person in front of her before the procedure in her employment manual." There was a silence. He said, "I am not offering you a gift. I want to be very clear about that, because I suspect you are the kind of person who would find a gift insulting. I am offering you a position that I believe you are uniquely qualified to fill, because I have never met a hospitality professional, and I have worked with many, who demonstrated in a single afternoon the combination of perception and courage and basic human decency that you demonstrated in my son's case." He named a salary. It was more than 2.5 times what I had made at the Magnolia Grand, including tips. He named benefits that covered Priya and covered me and covered things I had not had covered in 4 years. He named an equity stake in the hotel operation, which I would later spend 2 hours on the phone with his attorney understanding, an equity arrangement that would make me, over time, a minor but real participant in the success of the property. I sat at my kitchen table with the November evening coming in through the windows, and I said, "Mr. Hartman, I need to ask you something honestly." He said, "Please." I said, "What is this about for you? Not the business rationale. What is this actually about?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought I had asked something he would not answer. Then he said, "It is about the fact that my son held your hand. In that hallway, when you were leaving, he held your hand and asked you not to go. And when I asked him about you afterward, when he was getting better, he called you the lemonade lady. He said you were the nicest person at the restaurant. He said she could tell I was sick. He said that to me, his father who had spent the entire day with him, as though it were a remarkable thing that someone could tell he was sick. And I have been thinking about what that says about what kind of father I have been, and what it says about the kind of person you are, and I think you deserve more than a reversed misconduct classification on a file that nobody will ever look at again." I held that for a moment. I said, "I will need to think about this." He said, "Please take the time you need. There is no pressure and no deadline." I said, "There is one thing I need to know before I consider this further." He said, "Ask it." I said, "Did you understand in that restaurant why I did what I did?" He said, "No, not in the moment. In the moment, I understood it as presumption, as a server overstepping into a domain that was not hers." He said, "I understand now. I understand that you saw a child who needed help and you helped him because that is who you are, because that is what you do when you see a child who needs help, and you did not let the cost to yourself factor into the decision until after the decision was made." He said, "I have tried to think about what I would have done in your position, and I cannot answer that question honestly in a way that flatters me." I said, "That is an honest answer." He said, "It is the least I can manage." After I hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet of my kitchen. The evening had deepened into real dark, and the kitchen light was on, and the refrigerator was running, and somewhere in the apartment, my daughter was doing homework with her earbuds in. I sat and I let myself feel the full shape of the last 4 weeks, the hallway and the service exit, and the parking garage and the grocery store vest, and Miss Dollar's loan, and the cold parking lot phone calls, all of it. And I let myself feel the full shape of what had just happened. I let myself understand slowly that the choice I had made, the choice that had cost me everything I thought I had led me to this kitchen table with this conversation recently ended, and this future not yet accepted but present before me in a way that nothing in my life had been present before. I went to Priya's room. I knocked, and she said come in with the teenager inflection that is simultaneously permission and mild inconvenience. I sat on the edge of her bed, and she turned from her desk with my grandmother's eyes, and I told her everything. All of it. From the beginning. From the lemonade and Noah's small hands folded on the tablecloth to the thermometer, to Marcus's face, to the service exit, to the parking garage minutes, to the grocery store vest, to Cecilia Hartman at Register 5, to the phone call I had just ended. I told her all of it because she was 14 years old and she had been carrying part of this weight without my permission, because she loved me and could not help it, and she deserved to know the full shape of what we had been carrying together. When I finished, she sat for a moment looking at me. Then she said, "Mom, you took his temperature." I said, "I did." She said, "That is the minimum possible thing. Any person with a functioning heart would do that." I said, "Yes." She said, "And they fired you for it." I said, "Yes." She thought about this with the particular seriousness of a teenager who is actually taking something seriously rather than performing the taking of it seriously. Then she said, "And now the kid's dad is offering you a job because you took his temperature. Because you saw that a child needed help and you helped him even though it cost you everything." I said, "That is essentially what happened." She was quiet for another moment. Then she turned back to her laptop, and then she stopped and turned back to me, and she said, "Do you know what I think about?" I said, "What do you think about?" She said, "I think about Grandma Ray washing dishes in that kitchen in Macon at 5 in the morning before her first shift, telling you that nobody could take your dignity unless you handed it to them." She looked at me steadily. She said, "You didn't hand it to them, Mom. You didn't hand it to any of them." I did not say anything. I could not. She said, "I think you should take the job. Not because of the salary. Because you built something in that restaurant for 11 years and they took it, and now you get to build something new from scratch, and this time it's yours." Priya was 14 years old and she had my grandmother's eyes, and she had looked at the whole shape of our last 4 weeks, and she had said the thing that I needed to hear said. Not because I needed permission or validation, but because I needed to hear it from someone who had been watching me closely enough to know whether it was true. I called Richard Hartman the following morning, and I told him I would accept the position. The Beaumont Hotel opened its doors in Midtown Atlanta 7 months later. I will not pretend that those 7 months were easy or that I navigated them without uncertainty, because that would be a dishonest account, and I have committed to honesty in this telling. There were days during the build-out, and the hiring and the policy writing, and the vendor negotiations, and the 1,000 decisions that go into creating a hospitality experience from the ground floor when I sat in the half-finished restaurant space with sawdust on the floor and light fixtures, not yet hung, and asked myself what I thought I was doing, whether I was qualified for this, whether the confidence that had been placed in me was misplaced. The imposter feeling is real, and it does not respect your resume or your track record or your grandmother's words. It visits anyway. What I did on those days was remember the hallway. I remembered what it had felt like to fold that apron and set it on that shelf, and understand that something I had built over 11 years was being disassembled in front of me. And I remembered that I had done it with my back straight and my face composed and my grandmother's words somewhere in the architecture of my spine. And then I picked up the decision in front of me and I made it, because that is what you do when you have built things before and had them taken and then been given the chance to build again. You remember what you know. You remember that you know it. I hired 6 of the Beaumont's initial staff myself. Through a process that I wrote and refined over 3 weeks, and that Richard Hartman reviewed but did not modify, which was itself a signal about the kind of working relationship we would have, one in which he trusted the expertise he had hired and did not second-guess it for the pleasure of second-guessing it. I screened for what I had learned to call the seeing instinct, the ability to look at a person and understand something real about their experience without their having said it, the thing that had made me crouch beside Noah's chair and ask how he was doing in a way that made it safe for him to tell the truth. You can teach a great deal in hospitality. You can teach wine knowledge and service sequence and presentation standards and conflict resolution protocols. You cannot teach the seeing instinct. You either have it or you develop it through years of paying a kind of attention that most people are not willing to sustain. Every person I hired for the Beaumont had it. I wrote the value statement for the Beaumont myself, all 12 lines of it, which I drafted at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning with Priya asleep in the next room and a cup of coffee beside me that I did not drink until it was cold because I was too engaged in the writing to remember it was there. The first line reads, "We believe that the most important thing we can offer any guest is the feeling that they are truly seen." The rest of the statement follows from that line the way a river follows from its source. Marcus Delaney remains at the Magnolia Grand. I know this from people we have in common in the Atlanta hospitality community, who mention it with the careful casualness of people navigating a topic that has history. I do not follow his career with any particular attention. I hold no specific feeling about Marcus. He made the choice that served him in the moment, and every choice of that kind has its own natural weight that travels with it through time. He will carry his. I am occupied with carrying mine. Noah came to the Beaumont with his father and his grandmother Cecilia on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, 8 months after I had started there. He had grown a full inch since November, and he had more color in his face, and there was something different in the quality of his stillness. A different kind of careful, less like self-protection and more like genuine attention. The kind of stillness that comes from a child who is beginning to understand that the world is interesting and that paying attention to it is pleasurable rather than necessary for survival. He sat at a table in the Beaumont's courtyard under the magnolia tree that had been there when we acquired the property, and that I had insisted on keeping when the landscape architect suggested removing it. And he had lemonade, made fresh that morning with Florida lemons and local honey. And when he took the first sip, he closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Richard watched this from across the courtyard with an expression on his face that I have thought about many times since, and that I believe was the expression of a father who is doing the work of becoming someone better and who is, in the particular way of people for whom gratitude does not come naturally, because they have not had sufficient practice with it, grateful for the witness of someone who knew where they started. He said, "Noah asked if you were going to be here today." I said, "Did he?" He said he calls you the lemonade lady. He told his teacher about you in a class exercise about people who helped them. He said the lemonade lady could tell I was sick before anyone else could. His teacher sent me a note about it. He paused, and there was something in his jaw that was working through a feeling too large for his usual vocabulary. He said, "I keep that note in my desk." Cecilia Hartman put her hand over mine on the table. She said after the night Noah was sick, when he was better and the antibiotics were working and he could sit up again and eat a little, I sat with him in the hotel room and he told me about you. She looked at me with her steady, kind eyes. He said, "Grandma, the lemonade lady held my hand." She held my hand when she had to go. I looked at the magnolia tree. I breathed through my nose. She said, "He will always remember that. I want you to know that." Here is what I know now that I did not know in that hallway. I know that the dignity my grandmother spoke about at the kitchen sink every morning is not something you possess in the good times. It is what you are made of in the difficult ones, the specific thing you find in your hands when they are empty of everything else. The hallway, the folded apron, the service exit, those were not the moments when my dignity was taken. Those were the moments when it became visible, to me and to anyone paying attention, because it was the only thing left standing. I know that goodness returns to you, not because the universe is a just machine calibrated to reward good behavior. It is not, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling you something. Goodness returns to you because the choices you make from goodness ripple outward in ways you cannot track or predict, and some of those ripples come back to you in forms you would not have imagined, at times you would not have chosen, through people you would not have expected. Noah's hand in mine was a small thing. The lemonade was a small thing. The thermometer was a small thing dressed up in courage. And the ripple from those small things eventually reached me at Register 5 in a grocery store vest, and then a kitchen table phone call, and then an office with tall windows looking out at a magnolia tree. I know that the people who fire you for caring about a sick child are wrong about you. They are operating from a map of the world in which loyalty and compassion are assets with depreciating value, and your worth as a human being is directly indexed to your current usefulness to the institution. That map produces a certain kind of life and a certain kind of world, and those people are welcome to both. You are not obligated to inhabit the world they are building. I know that 14-year-old girls who have been watching their mothers carefully will tell you the thing you need to hear if you give them the full picture and the space to be honest. And I know that the space to be honest is what parents owe their children more than protection from difficult truths. Because children who are protected from difficult truths do not learn to navigate difficult truths. They learn only that difficult truths exist and are hidden from them, which is a much lonelier education. I know that Miss Dollars in her house in Macon with her garden is more prosperous in the ways that matter than anyone who has ever written a check for a property they intend to leverage. And I know that prosperity in the ways that matter is not a consolation prize. It is the thing itself. I run the Beaumont Hotel in Midtown Atlanta. I have a staff of 14 people, every one of whom I would trust in any room with any guest. We have been open for 8 months, and our occupancy rate is the highest of any comparable property in the city, and our guest satisfaction scores are in the 97th percentile for our category. And I do not lead with these numbers because I think they are the point, but I include them because they demonstrate something worth demonstrating, which is that caring about the people in front of you is not in conflict with running a successful operation. It is, in fact, the engine of it. My office has tall windows that look out over the courtyard with the magnolia tree. I did not plan the magnolia. It was there when we arrived. I keep it because it is beautiful, and because some things that are beautiful deserve to be kept simply because they are beautiful and for no more complicated reason than that. Priya is 15 now, and she is taking AP History and thinking about colleges, and she has my grandmother's eyes and her own particular and formidable intelligence, and a sense of justice that I take both pride and a certain loving alarm in. Because justice at 15 has a purity to it that the world will complicate, and I hope the complications make her more precise rather than more cynical. She came to see the Beaumont the week before we opened. She walked through every room with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. She stood in the courtyard under the magnolia tree and looked up at the branches and then looked at me and said, "Mom, this is yours." I said, "It's ours." She said, "It started with a thermometer." I said, "It started long before that. It started in a kitchen in Macon at 5 in the morning." She thought about this. She said, "I want to meet her someday." I said, "You have her eyes." She looked at me for a moment, and then she smiled, the real smile, not the photographed one. She said, "I know. If you have ever been that child reaching for someone in a moment when everything feels too large and the adults around you are not paying attention, I want you to know that there are Delia Monroes in the world. They are in the places you do not expect to find them, at Register 5 and Table 4 and back hallways with folded aprons, and they are paying attention when no one has asked them to, and they will hold your hand when it is time to let go. If you have ever been the person holding on at cost to yourself, if you have ever made the right choice in the moment when the wrong choice would have been so much more convenient and so much less expensive, I want you to know that I see you. I know what it costs. I know the particular loneliness of doing the visible right thing in front of people who have decided the right thing is too expensive. I know the service exit. I know the parking garage minutes. I know the kitchen table with the bills spread out and the composure finally giving way. And I want to tell you from the other side of all of it that what you did in that moment is not gone. It did not dissolve into the air. It landed somewhere. It is landing somewhere right now, in ways you cannot see yet, in ways you may not see for months or years, but they are real and they are growing. You are not the apron. You were never the apron. You are the choice. Now, if you have stayed with me all the way to this moment, thank you. This story cost me something to tell, and your presence in it means something to me that I cannot fully quantify. I want to ask you to do something. Scroll down right now and leave a comment. Tell me your name. Tell me what city you are watching from. Tell me about a moment in your life when you did the right thing at real cost to yourself. Because this space is meant to be a place where we hold each other's stories the way Noah held my hand in that hallway, with both hands firmly, even at the end of things. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and hit that notification bell so that you do not miss what is coming next. Because I have more stories. I have the story of the morning, 6 months into my time at the Beaumont, when someone from my past walked through the front door as a guest. Someone who had been in that hallway. Someone whose presence I had not anticipated and who did not anticipate mine. And what happened in the conversation that followed. A conversation that lasted 4 hours and ended in a way that neither of us could have predicted, and that I believe will change the way you think about forgiveness and what it is actually for. You do not want to miss it. I am Delia Ray Monroe. I run the Beaumont Hotel in Midtown Atlanta. I take temperatures when children have fevers. I fold aprons carefully when they have to be set down. I hold hands at the end of things, and I will see you in the next video. Leave your name and your city in the comments below. I am listening. I am always listening. But before I let you go, I want to go back. I want to go back to the beginning in a different way, to the things that made me who I was before the hallway, because the hallway is not where this story truly starts. Every story that looks like it starts with a crisis actually starts much earlier, in the years and the rooms and the choices that shaped the person who walked into the crisis. And I want to tell you about those years because they are the years that matter most, even though they look like nothing from the outside. I grew up, as I told you, in Macon with my grandmother. My mother was in my life, but inconsistently, the way some parents are in their children's lives, present for stretches and absent for stretches, and not through cruelty exactly, but through the particular combination of her own damage and the world's demands on a young Black woman in the South with no college degree and a child, and not enough margin for error in any direction. I do not tell you this to diminish her. She loved me. I knew she loved me even during the absences, the way you can know something is true even when the evidence for it is limited. But the person who raised me was Ray Louise Monroe, and the house where I learned what I was made of was that 2-bedroom house in Macon with the sandy soil and the deep shade and the kitchen sink that looked out at the backyard that nothing much grew in. My grandmother made her first shift at the textile plant at 6 in the morning, and her second shift began at 2 in the afternoon and ended at 10 at night. And on the days when she worked both shifts, she came home smelling of the particular combination of cotton fiber and machine oil, and something industrial I could never name, and she would eat a plate of whatever I had made for dinner. Which from the time I was 8 years old was always something I had made myself, because she had taught me that feeding yourself and the people you love was a fundamental act of self-determination. And then she would sit in the chair in the living room for exactly 20 minutes, and then she would get up, and she would ask me what I had learned that day. Not what had happened, not how school was. What had I learned? It was a specific question, and it required a specific answer, and she held me to it every single evening of my childhood, through elementary school and middle school, and the fractured, complicated years of high school when learning felt like a secondary concern compared to the social architecture of surviving adolescence. What did you learn today? I learned about the water cycle. I learned about the Civil War and who was left out of the version of it that the textbook was telling. I learned that my English teacher grades harder on the essays of certain students than on others, and I intend to be so undeniably excellent that she cannot justify any grade below an A. My grandmother listened to all of it. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered what I had said the week before and referenced it. She was working 40, sometimes 50 hours a week with hands that were beginning to stiffen, and she came home and sat in that chair and gave me her full attention for 20 minutes every evening. And if you understand what full attention costs when you are already depleted, you understand that this was one of the most extraordinary gifts any person has ever given a child. She taught me to cook at 8, and to sew a button at 9, and to balance a checkbook at 11, which I thought at the time was the most boring thing anyone had ever attempted to teach me, and which I think about now with a particular gratitude every time I review the Beaumont's monthly operating statements. She taught me to look people in the eye when they were speaking to me, not because it was polite. She was clear that it was not only about politeness, but because people who could not look others in the eye while being spoken to were giving information about themselves that it was not always in their interest to give. She taught me that the most important thing about any job was not the job itself, but what you were building inside yourself while you did it. The discipline and the attention and the integrity of doing something well even when no one was checking whether you were doing it well. And that those things belonged to you and no employer or circumstance could take them because they lived in you and not in the position. I went to college on a partial academic scholarship and tips from weekend shifts and a determination that felt less like ambition and more like physics, like something that was simply going to happen because the alternative did not exist in my internal architecture. I studied for 2 years, and then my grandmother had a small health crisis that required me to be in Macon more, and the scholarship did not cover the cost of traveling back and forth. And the tips from the restaurant job I had in Atlanta did not bridge the gap, and I made the decision to leave school with the intention of returning, and I never returned, which is the particular mathematics of circumstance and intention that I have made my peace with over the years without pretending the peace came easily. I got better at serving tables. I moved to Atlanta, which felt necessary and terrifying in the specific way that all necessary and terrifying things feel. And I found my first Atlanta restaurant job at 22, and I worked there for 3 years until a regular customer told me about a position opening at a hotel restaurant downtown. And I applied and got it and worked there for 4 years until I heard that the Magnolia Grand was staffing up, and I applied and got it and stayed for 11 years. Each of those positions built on the last. Each of those positions added something to the inventory of things I knew how to do and the catalog of people I knew how to read and the repertoire of situations I knew how to navigate. I was not circling. I was building, even when it did not feel like building, even when it felt like simply surviving the shift and getting to the car and making it home. I met Priya's father when I was 26. His name was Arjun, and he was kind and funny and deeply committed to a version of his future that turned out not to have much space in it for the woman he had married when the future was still abstract. I do not tell you this to be cruel about him either. He was not a villain. He was a person whose idea of his own life was specific in ways that he had not known to tell me, and I was a person whose idea of my life was being built in real time out of necessity. And eventually, those two things were incompatible in ways that could not be papered over with goodwill and shared history. We divorced when Priya was 4. He is in her life, inconsistently, which is the word I seem to return to when describing the particular pattern of caring, but limited that I have encountered in people I have loved. She navigates it with more equanimity than I had at her age, which I attribute partly to her own temperament, and partly to the fact that she has never had to wonder whether she was the center of someone's world, because she has been the center of mine. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand that by the time I arrived at the Magnolia Grand at 30 years old, I had already been building something for 30 years. I had been building the specific person who would know to crouch beside a child's chair and ask the real question and wait for the real answer and take the thermometer from the first aid kit and do the thing that needed doing. That person was not assembled quickly. She was assembled over 30 years of kitchen sink mornings and 20-minute evenings and college courses and tip nights and difficult phone calls and necessary moves. And the long, patient discipline of doing things well when no one was watching because you had been taught that the doing well was for you. It lived in you, and it would go where you went. And here is the thing about a person who has been building for 30 years by the time the crucial moment arrives. They do not stop building just because someone fires them. The building is not in the position. The building is in the person. Marcus Delaney could take the Magnolia Grand from me. He could not take 30 years of kitchen sink mornings. He could not take the thermometer reading or the way Noah's face had changed or the 17 minutes in the parking garage during which I had cried and then stopped and then breathed through my nose and driven home. All of that was mine. All of that was in me. All of that walked with me through the service exit and got in the car and drove home to the apartment with the 7 plaques on the wall and made oatmeal for dinner, and filed for unemployment, and wrote down the facts in plain language and called the legal aid hotline. None of that went away when the apron was folded. I want to talk about something else before I bring you fully to the present. Something that happened in the middle of the weeks between leaving the Magnolia Grand and starting the Beaumont. Something smaller than Cecilia Hartman at Register 5 and less dramatic than Richard Hartman's phone call. But something that I think is important to this story in the way that the quiet scenes in a film are sometimes more important than the ones that everybody remembers. 3 weeks after I left the Magnolia Grand, I was working a Tuesday afternoon shift at the grocery store. It was slow. The other cashier on the floor that afternoon was a woman named Patris, who was maybe 60 years old and had worked at that grocery store for 14 years, and who had the particular quality of person who has found a way to be genuinely present in a job that does not ask much of her, which is its own form of mastery. We had been exchanging the careful pleasantries of people who are professionally proximate, but not yet personally connected for the 2 weeks I had been working there. And on that Tuesday afternoon, the store was slow enough that there was time for actual conversation. She asked me how long I had been working in groceries. I told her I had not been working in groceries long. I told her I had come from fine dining. She asked where, and I told her, and her eyebrows went up slightly, because the Magnolia Grand had a reputation even among people who could not afford it, the way certain things have reputations that travel beyond the population that directly experiences them. She said, "What happened?" I told her. Not everything, but the shape of it. The child and the thermometer and the misconduct classification. I told it plainly, without embellishment or self-pity, the way I had trained myself to tell difficult things since my grandmother taught me that the facts themselves were usually sufficient and that editorial additions were often more about the teller's comfort than the listener's understanding. Patris listened to all of it. Then she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I think about when I hear a story like that?" I said, "What?" She said, "I think about all the people who didn't take the temperature. I think about all the moments in every restaurant and every hospital and every school and every ordinary situation where a person saw something and made the calculation and decided the cost was too high and walked past." She said, "Those people still have their jobs." She looked at me. She said, "But they know. Somewhere in them, they know. And that knowing costs something too. It just gets paid out differently, a little bit at a time over a long time, and by the time the bill is fully due, most people don't even remember what it was for." I thought about this for a long time after she said it. I think about it still. Because she was right in a way that is both true and insufficient, by which I mean it is accurate that the cost of not doing the right thing is real even when it is invisible. And it is also true that the person who paid the visible price in that hallway was me and not the people who walked past. And both of those things are true at the same time, and the holding of both simultaneously is what honesty about injustice actually requires. You cannot dismiss the cost by pointing to the invisible cost on the other side of the ledger. The cost was real. It was mine. It was also, ultimately, the foundation of something I would not trade. Patris and I ate lunch together in the break room on every shared shift for the 4 months before I left for the Beaumont. She brought food from home that was always extraordinary, the kind of cooking that is the result of decades of refinement and love, and she shared it without making a production of it, the way truly generous people share things. She told me about her 14 years at that store and the particular satisfaction she found in knowing the regulars and remembering their preferences, and the way a familiar face over a checkout counter could be a real comfort to a person having a hard week. She said, "People think this job is nothing." She said it without any particular bitterness, just as an observation. She said, "They're wrong." I thought about that when I was writing the values statement for the Beaumont. I thought about Patris and my grandmother and the 20-minute evenings and the kitchen sink mornings and the textile plant hands and the checkout counter familiarity. I thought about all of the people in all of the ordinary places doing the work of truly seeing the people in front of them, the invisible labor of genuine attention, and I tried to write something that honored that work without romanticizing it, that named it as essential without making it precious. What I came up with was 12 lines. The first one I have already told you. The last one reads, "We remember that every person who walks through our door is in the middle of a story we cannot see, and our work is to meet them where that story is, not where we need it to be." I thought about Noah's father when I wrote that last line. I thought about a man on a phone call who needed the day to be normal because he had run out of room for abnormal, who had looked at his son and chosen to see what he needed to see rather than what was actually there. I did not write that line as a judgment of Richard Hartman. I wrote it as a reminder to myself and to everyone who would work at the Beaumont that the distance between seeing clearly and seeing what we need to see is sometimes very small, and it is in that small distance where the most important work of any hospitality professional is done. You can be trained to bring the right dish at the right temperature. You cannot be trained to see past your own need of the moment. That is something you have to choose again and again in every room. Richard Hartman and I have developed, over the 8 months since the Beaumont opened, a working relationship that I would describe as one of the more interesting professional relationships of my life. He is not my friend, exactly. The power asymmetry is real, and we both know it and do not pretend otherwise, which I respect. But he is something more than an employer in the way that certain working relationships become more when they are built on a genuine shared understanding of something difficult. He has been honest with me about Noah and about his marriage, and about the ways that his success as a businessman has sometimes operated in inverse proportion to his success as a father and a human being who is fully present in rooms that do not contain spreadsheets and acquisition strategies. He has told me these things not as confession, but as context, the way you tell a colleague things about yourself when you trust that the telling will not be used against you. I have tried to be worthy of that trust. Noah visits the Beaumont regularly. Richard brings him on Saturday afternoons when he has him for the weekend, and Noah has developed a relationship with the Beaumont's courtyard that I find genuinely moving. He treats it as his place in a way that children claim certain places, with the proprietary comfort of someone who has decided a location is friendly territory. He knows the names of all the staff. He knows that Rosa, who manages the front desk, keeps a small jar of the honey lemon candies that the Beaumont puts in guest rooms, and that she will give him one if he asks politely, which he always does. He knows that the chef, whose name is James, and who came from a restaurant in Savannah with a reputation for Southern coastal cuisine and a personal commitment to sourcing that I found immediately compelling, will let him watch the Messie en place if he comes to the kitchen window and asks on a Saturday afternoon when service is still an hour off. He knows where the magnolia tree drops its blossoms first in the spring, and he collects them with a scientific attention that is entirely his own. He still calls me the lemonade lady sometimes, which makes James laugh every time, and sometimes he calls me Miss Delia, which is the form of address we have settled on, and sometimes he just comes and sits beside me at the courtyard table when I am reviewing reports on a Saturday afternoon and does not say anything at all, just sits. The way certain children sit with certain adults when they have decided that proximity is enough. I find this more moving than I can easily express. To be someone's enough. To be the person a child chooses to sit beside in the afternoon. It is not nothing. It is, in the small calculus of real things, one of the largest things I have. I want to say something about forgiveness before I close, because I think it belongs here even though it is complicated, and I do not want to simplify it. People ask me sometimes, in the version of this conversation I have had with friends and with Priya, and with Miss Dolers on the phone on Sunday evenings, whether I have forgiven Marcus Delaney. And I understand why they ask it, because forgiveness is something we are taught to think of as both morally necessary and emotionally completing, the bow that ties the story closed. My honest answer is that I have not forgiven Marcus in the sense of having released all feeling about what he did. I think what he did was wrong, and I think he knew it was wrong, and I think the specific quality of its wrongness, the exploitation of an already accumulated professional friction to maximize the damage of a single incident, is not something that dissolves simply because the outcome ultimately redirected toward something better. Better outcomes do not retroactively justify wrong actions. This is important. It is important because if you are watching this and you have been wronged by someone and the injury is still fresh and someone tells you that everything happens for a reason and the good outcome proves the wrong was worth it, I want to offer you the full picture, which is that good outcomes and wrong actions can coexist without one canceling the other. Your injury was real. Marcus was wrong. And the Beaumont is also real and also good and also mine. All of those things are simultaneously true, and none of them cancels any of the others. What I have made my peace with is this. Marcus operated from a map of the world that produced certain choices, and I operated from a different map. And the consequences of those different choices are now both in evidence. I am not sitting in judgment of his consequences. I am in Midtown Atlanta with 14 people and a magnolia tree and a value statement that begins with the words we believe. He is wherever he is, with whatever his 14 years at the Magnolia Grand have built in him, and I hope it is enough for him. I genuinely hope that, not as performance and not as spiritual exercise. as the simple recognition that a person who needs to diminish others to feel adequate to themselves is not a person who has found peace, and I would wish peace on almost anyone, even people who have been unkind to me, because I have lived without it and I know what that particular absence costs. I want to close with my grandmother. I always want to close with my grandmother, because she is where I begin and where I return, the way certain rivers return to their source in a flood year, reversing direction, seeking the thing that made them. Her hands curled in on themselves in the last 5 years of her life at the textile plant, slowly, joint by joint, the way things sometimes deteriorate that have given everything they had without complaint for decades, and then simply begin to show the evidence of it all at once, as though they had been waiting until the work was done to let the damage be visible. She could not grip her coffee mug at the end. She used a travel mug with a wide handle that she could get all 4 fingers through, and she held it that way, 4-fingered, every morning at the kitchen sink, looking out at the backyard where nothing much grew, and she still said the words. Every morning she still said the words. After she retired, the hands got worse for a while, and then stabilized, and she spent the last 6 years of her life in that house in Macon, with a garden that Miss Dollars helped her tend. A garden that was, by some combination of Miss Dollars' knowledge and my grandmother's determination, and the specific quality of attention they gave it, more productive than the sandy shaded soil had any right to be. She grew tomatoes and collard greens and 3 kinds of beans and a rosemary bush that got so large it eventually had to be cut back. And she gave away most of what she grew because the growing of it was the point and not the having of it, which is a distinction that I have returned to often in thinking about my own work and what it is for. She died 6 years ago on a Tuesday morning in October with the kitchen sink in front of her and the backyard out the window and Miss Dollars holding her hand, which was curled but warm, and which had spent 38 years making things so that other people could have them. She was 77 years old. She had worked since she was 14. She had raised me. She had said the words every morning. She had given me a map of the world that could hold both the textile plant and the Beaumont, both the folded apron and the tall windows, both the parking garage minutes and the magnolia tree, both the cost and the return. I have a photograph of her on my desk in the Beaumont office. It is not from the kitchen sink, though I wish I had one from there. It is from a Sunday afternoon when Priya was about 6, and my grandmother and Priya are in the backyard in Macon with the garden, and my grandmother has her 4-fingered grip around a coffee mug, and she is looking at Priya with an expression that I have only seen on the faces of people who are looking at the next generation of something they built with their own damaged hands, and understanding that the building was worth it. Priya is looking at a tomato on the vine with the scientific intensity of a 6-year-old who has discovered that tomatoes are a fact of the world and not a given. My grandmother is smiling. The garden is green around them. The rosemary is already getting too big. I look at that photograph every morning when I arrive at the office. And I think this is the inheritance, not the plaques on the wall, not the equity stake, not the salary. the knowledge that what you build inside yourself travels, that it goes where you go, that it finds its way into the hands and the eyes of the people who come after you, and that they carry it forward in ways you cannot predict and will not always see. The lemonade is always fresh. The doors are always open. The magnolia drops its blossoms in the courtyard on warm Atlanta afternoons, and a boy collects them with the attention of a scientist, and I watch from my desk with the tall windows, and I think about a woman at a kitchen sink in Macon telling me the one true thing. Nobody can take it from you, unless you hand it to them first. I am Delia Ray Monroe. Subscribe, leave your name and your city, and I will see you in the next video. There is one more thing I need to tell you before this video ends, one more piece of the story that I held back intentionally because I needed to know you were still with me before I shared it. And if you are still here, watching, then you are the person I saved this for. 4 months after the Beaumont opened, I received a letter. An actual paper letter in a white envelope with a Macon return address I did not recognize. I opened it at my desk on a Thursday morning with my coffee beside me and the light from the courtyard, windows falling across my hands. And inside was a single sheet of paper written in handwriting that had the particular quality of someone who learned to write when penmanship was still taught as a serious discipline. The letters careful and slightly formal and completely legible. It was from a woman named Gloria Tanner. She wrote that she had heard about me from her granddaughter, who had been in Priya's class at school and who had been told by Priya about what had happened at the Magnolia Grand and what had come after. She wrote that she had worked for 31 years as a housekeeper at a hotel in Macon, which she named, a hotel I knew from my childhood as one of the downtown properties that had seemed to me enormously glamorous in the way that hotels seem glamorous to children who have never stayed in one. She wrote that she had been fired from that hotel in her 28th year of service for refusing to clean a room that had been trashed by a guest in a way she described as degrading, and that she would not describe further in the letter, which I understood and respected. She wrote that she had been classified as insubordinate and had lost her benefits at 54 years old, and had spent the next 3 years cleaning private homes until her knees made that impossible, and she was now 61 and living with her daughter, and she was not writing to me for anything. She was writing to me because she wanted me to know that she had read what she could find about the Beaumont and about how it was being run and the things that were being said about it by the people who worked there and the people who had stayed there. And she wanted me to know that what I was doing mattered to her in a way that she found difficult to articulate, but that had to do with the idea that there existed somewhere in the world of hospitality a place that was being built from the assumption that the people inside it, staff and guests alike, deserved to be truly seen. She wrote that she had spent 31 years making rooms comfortable for people who did not know her name and who would not have been able to pick her face out of a lineup, and that she had done this work well and with care, and that she had always believed the work mattered, even when the institution she worked for made it clear that the work was the only thing about her that mattered, and only to the extent that she continued to perform it without friction. She wrote that she hoped the Beaumont was different. She wrote that she thought, from what she had read, that it might be. She signed the letter Gloria Tanner, and then below her name she wrote in smaller letters, "I held my dignity too. I just never got the Beaumont." I read that letter 3 times. Then I sat at my desk for a few minutes with the courtyard light on my hands. Then I called my assistant and asked her to find a contact number for Gloria Tanner in Macon, which she did within the hour. I called the number. Gloria answered on the 4th ring with a voice that was wary in the way that older people's voices sometimes get wary with unknown numbers, the wariness of someone who has learned that unexpected calls are rarely good news. I said, "Ms. Tanner, my name is Delia Monroe. I run the Beaumont Hotel in Atlanta. You sent me a letter." There was a silence. Then she said, "I didn't expect a call." I said, "I didn't expect the letter. I'm glad it came." She said, "I meant what I said." I wasn't asking for anything. I said, "I know. I'm not calling to offer you anything you haven't asked for. I am calling because your letter mattered to me and I thought you should know that, person to person, which a return letter would not have accomplished the same way." She was quiet again. Then she said, "She did good work then. Your grandmother." I said, "She really did." She said, "Mine too. Mine worked in a school cafeteria in Macon for 22 years. She said the same kind of thing, I think. Different words, same idea. I said, "What words did she use?" She thought about it. She said she used to say, "Do the job like it has your name on it, even if nobody ever knows whose name it is." She said this carefully, like she was reading it from somewhere inside herself where she kept things precisely. I said, "That's right. That's exactly right." We talked for 47 minutes. I know because I looked at the call log afterward, surprised by the time. She told me about the 31 years and the room and the firing and the 3 years of cleaning houses and her daughter, who was a nurse, and her granddaughter, who was 12 and apparently very taken with the idea of hotel management, which Gloria found both amusing and quietly gratifying. I told her about the Magnolia Grand and Noah and the thermometer and Cecilia Hartman at Register 5 and the phone call and the Beaumont. I told her about my grandmother and the kitchen sink and the textile plant hands and the 20-minute evenings. At the end of the conversation, she said, "You know what strikes me about all of it?" I said, "What?" She said, "The children. Noah held your hand. Priya told her friend. Her friend told her grandmother. Her grandmother wrote you a letter. She said, children carry things forward. They carry what they see adults do with dignity. They carry it somewhere we can't follow, and it shows up in places we didn't expect." I thought about this for a long time after we hung up. I still think about it. I think about the way things travel through the hands of children, the way a memory of someone holding your hand in a hallway at the end of something can travel through years and conversations and school friendships and grandmother's letters until it arrives on a desk in Midtown Atlanta on a Thursday morning and sits in the light from the courtyard windows and reminds someone of why they are doing what they are doing. I offered Gloria Tanner nothing in that phone call. She had not asked for anything, and I respected that. But 2 weeks later, I called her again, and I told her that the Beaumont was developing a paid internship program for hospitality students that I was building in partnership with a technical college in Atlanta, and that the program included a consulting component where practitioners with decades of real hospitality experience could come in and speak with students about the work, as it is actually done rather than as it is theorized in curricula. I told her that we paid an honorarium for these sessions. I told her that if she was ever in Atlanta and interested, we would be grateful to have her. She came in March. She sat at a table in the Beaumont's small conference room with 8 students from the technical college program, and she talked for 90 minutes about 31 years of making rooms. She talked about the invisible work of hospitality, the work that is done in the spaces between the things that guests see, the specific attention and care that goes into a room that is prepared for someone who does not know you prepared it and will not think about how it came to be ready for them. She talked about finding your name in your own work even when your name is not on anything. She talked about dignity as a professional practice, which is what it is when you strip away all of the elevated language around it. It is simply the practice of doing the job as though it matters, as though you matter, as though the person you will never meet who will sleep in the room you made deserves the care you are giving it. She was extraordinary. Every student in the room was completely still for 90 minutes, which is not a thing that happens in educational settings without genuine quality in the speaker. I sat in the back and watched her and thought about my grandmother and the kitchen sink and the 20-minute evenings and Gloria's grandmother and the school cafeteria in Macon, and the way a thing can travel through time in the hands of people who believe it is worth carrying. After the session, she and I sat in the courtyard under the magnolia tree, and I brought her lemonade without asking, and she took a sip and looked at me and said, "You put honey in this instead of sugar." I said, "From a local farm." She said, "That's good, that's right." We sat for a while without talking. The afternoon light was long and gold across the courtyard, and the magnolia was beginning to put out its spring blossoms, and a mockingbird was doing its magnificent thing in the branches overhead. And the Beaumont was very quiet in the way that it is quiet in the mid-afternoon, a living quiet, a quality of readiness and attention that I had worked very hard to build into the culture of the place, and that I was still sometimes surprised to find fully present. The way you are surprised by things you have built when they exceed what you imagined. Gloria looked around the courtyard and she said, "This is a good place." I said, "We're working on it." She said, "No, it already is. You can't fake that quality. Either the people inside a place have it or they don't, and yours do." I said, "I hired for it." She said, "You can't hire for it unless you have it yourself first." She came back in June for the second session. She is coming again in September. Her granddaughter is 12 and has apparently decided she wants to work in hotel management. And Gloria says this with a complicated expression that contains both the pride of a grandmother who sees her family reaching for something and the wariness of a woman who spent 31 years in an industry that did not always deserve the reaching. I have told her privately that the reaching is worth it, that the industry is changing, and the people who are changing it are people like her granddaughter who arrive already knowing their own worth, which is the one thing the people who came before them could not always count on knowing and which makes all the difference. And so, the story keeps traveling. Through Noah's hand and Priya's friendship and Gloria's letter and her granddaughter's ambition, and the technical college program, And the students who sit in the Beaumont conference room and hear about doing the job like your name is on it even when no one knows whose name it is. It keeps traveling in the way that the things built by people like my grandmother and Gloria's grandmother keep traveling, through the hands of the people they taught and the people those people teach, forward and outward, finding its way into rooms we did not imagine. This is what I wanted to tell you. This is the whole of it. The thermometer was a small act. The lemonade was smaller. The holding of a hand at the end of a hallway was smaller still. But small acts done from genuine care travel farther and more persistently than anyone who performs them usually gets to see. You rarely get to see the full distance your small acts travel. I got lucky. I got to see some of it. I got to see Noah close his eyes over the lemonade, and I got to see Gloria Tanner in the courtyard with the afternoon light on her face, and I got to see my daughter say, "I think Grandma Ray knew what she was talking about." And I get to come to this office every morning and look at the photograph of my grandmother and my daughter in a Macon garden, and understand that what is in me is also in Priya, and what is in Priya will go where she goes. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is, in fact, everything. Subscribe to this channel. Leave your name and your city in the comments. Tell me one thing that someone did for you in a moment when it cost them something. Or tell me one thing you did. Tell me both. We are building something here in the comments, in the stories we share with each other, and every story is a small act that travels farther than we know. My name is Delia Ray Monroe. The lemonade is always fresh. The door is always open. And I will see you next time.